Hello all, welcome to Colonial Canada for fall 2020. It's been quite the summer. I hope your summer has been safe. I hope your summer has been as fulfilling as it can be. It's difficult to have a truly fulfilling summer in situations like this. I'm sure some of you had difficulty finding jobs and that sort of thing. But we're back at it. We're here for another school year, and it'll be happening under pretty extraordinary circumstances. I'll try to avoid all the cliches that are being tossed out all the time here, but it has been an exceptional year, a difficult one for many people, and we're going to talk a little bit about that at the end of this little introduction here today. I do hope that the school year works as well as possible, and I'm going to do my best to make this course work as well as possible for you, and hopefully we can all get through this together and learn a lot and step back from this with a better sense of colonial history, of Canadian history, and of your place in all of that story. One of the things I like to do in this course is get you to think about not just the past, because really that doesn't matter in and of itself. What matters is the fact that it still matters today, that all of this has legacies today, political legacies, economic legacies, cultural legacies. And that's what we'll really want to take from this course, that you can understand our Canada, modern Canada, contemporary Canada, significantly through its colonial past, that it has lots of things to tell us about not just how we got here, but still who we are. And I think that'll be a big part of this course. We'll talk about this a lot as we go along. We cover a lot of ground in this. It's a survey course. That's what survey courses do. We're going to cover roughly 400 years of history. We'll cover French colonization. We'll cover British colonization. We'll cover the relationships between both the French and the British and themselves, and most particularly with Indigenous people. Another major feature of this course is that I really try to bring out a significant dimension of the Indigenous place in this story. It is a colonial story, and the relationships with Indigenous people are colonial relationships. And oftentimes that leads us to think of how they were mistreated, how they were marginalized, how they were treated by the British and by the French. We'll certainly cover that. But I think it's equally important to see their autonomy, their agency. They're looking out for their own interests. And I think what we'll see in this course is that Indigenous people had a major role in some of the stories that we'll be looking at. And that they weren't just ancillary figures, they weren't just allies of the British and the French, as you'll often see in older texts, but that they were carving stories and relationships in their own ways, in their own interests, thinking of their own futures, and trying to navigate the present as best as possible. There's no doubt that Indigenous people end up as marginalized peoples, as colonized peoples within North America. But that doesn't mean that they were marginalized from the beginning, and it doesn't mean that they didn't play important roles all through this. So that's what I'll really want to try to play here as a sense of understanding their active agency in trying to carve their own histories, and how ultimately they were unable to forge a stronger place for themselves in the country. And I think that is very much a legacy of Canadian history. So that's kind of the big picture stuff we'll look at. We'll look at major wars between Britain and France. We'll look at the Indigenous place in all of those wars, how they tried to negotiate all those things, their diplomacy, all that kind of big picture kind of stuff. We'll look at the big things like the 7 Years' War and the American Revolution, the war that made Canada, ironically. We'll get to that later. That's kind of basic stuff that we'll be doing. That's kind of a useful launch point right at this point to think about a general take on how this course works. Two things. First, we're going to look at what happened, basic content of the story of Canadian history, the major events and so on. Just knowing that general framework. That's complicated. There's a lot going on. It's important that you know that stuff. A lot of you will have had maybe bad, I hope you had good experiences, but many of you may have had bad experiences with high school history, and you might have thought of it as, oh, I had to memorize all these dates and things. I hope this course does something more than that. This course will certainly be an analytical course. But it's still important to just kind of know those things. You still need to know what happened in order to analyze it. Ultimately, we need some evidence, some content to work with. So knowing that big story, that basic what happened story, is very, very important. And we'll spend a fair bit of time talking about that. The lectures will be about that. Your online textbook will be about that. And you'll be certainly understanding the broad framework of what happened. The second thing, though, and this is where you'll spend most of your time in this course, is in the forums where we'll be discussing different historians and their interpretations of what happened in the past. Now we're going to spend the entire term looking at this, but just think about history as something that is thought about, written about, not lived. We don't live in the past. We only have access to the past through documents. Historians write books, and these books have words on paper. Historians put these words on paper, not the past. Historians interpret the past. They have evidence, they work with that evidence, they tell stories based on the evidence that they see. But we're human beings, and sometimes that evidence speaks to us in different ways. Sometimes we have biases, sometimes we have different perspectives, sometimes we look at different evidence. Historians choose the evidence that they look at. The ultimate outcome of that is that they tell the stories differently. We read each other's stories. Historians are, you're a graduate student in history, for example, you're expected to read very widely in your field to see what the different people are saying. But individual historians still write and think about things as individuals. And so we need to think about that as readers of history, as consumers of history, that what we're reading is not the history, but somebody's take on that history. Now that's not to say that it's all relative, that people just speak from their perspectives. That's nonsense. Historians work with evidence, and most historians work with integrity and try to demonstrate very, very clearly that they have a command of the sources, that they've looked at the evidence, and that they're trying to do so fairly. And most historians do that. But they'll still do it differently. And we need to think about that and work with that. So that's what we're going to be doing in this course most of the time. So we're going to be looking at historians' arguments in the first place, and we'll be looking at the evidence that they use to support those arguments. And that's ultimately what a good reader, a good consumer of history, a good reader or consumer of journalism, a good reader or consumer of basically anything out there. This is a very basic humanities, social science, business, science kind of skill. You need to know how to read and interpret arguments and evidence. That's what we're doing in this course. We'll also ask you to look at kind of the big wider context of all of this. We'll be looking at some big stories like the American Revolution and the 7 Years' War. These are not localized stories, these are global stories. And you'll see how that broader transnational picture affects the kinds of stories that we'll be looking at here on the ground. Most of your grade will come from seminar participation, forum participation, writing in the forums. You'll write 2 essays, a short one and a longer one, not especially long, but longer one. And all of that will come from those seminar readings. All of that will come from you analyzing, historians writing on particular topics, looking at one topic, several historians writing about it, and how they explain that story differently. I'll ask you to explain that back to me, explain how they arrived at those arguments, the evidence that they used, and so on. That's kind of the basics of the entire course. You'll do that in the forums, you'll do that in your essays. You'll have an exam at the end, and that exam will be partly based on content, but it'll also partly be based on you reflecting about your experiences dealing with history as something that's interpreted rather than something that's factual and clear. It's certainly factual, but sometimes the facts are up for grabs, up for interpretation. We'll talk more about that. Finally, I want to come back to COVID. I want to come back to the moment that we're in. I want to acknowledge that you're going to have a difficult term. Not in this course. Well, you might well. I hope not, but you might well. But I think this term is going to be difficult in all kinds of ways. I hope to God it's not difficult in that we don't have a major second wave or something like that. I hope, please God, that doesn't happen. But I think it's going to be a difficult term because most of you are doing strictly online courses. I think you're going to have your heads stuck in computer screens for long periods of time. In this course, you'll have a book. I'm hoping that book will be a bit of a respite for you away from the screens. But I think it's going to be difficult. You're going to be spending a lot of time not talking to each other directly, not having that kind of social engagement that can make school much richer, much more fulfilling, both socially and academically. It's going to be harder to do all that stuff online. We're going to try to build some of that into the course, but it's going to be difficult. So I'm just going to say to you now that I understand that I understand that this is going to be a difficult term, and that you can talk to me about that. You can contact me, you can send me emails, you can call me on the phone, we can talk on Teams. There's all kinds of ways we can communicate. You can also talk to your TAs. I hope your TAs are happy to talk to you about these kinds of things. And certainly, I would say to you that probably you should stick to them for the strictly academic forum, seminar, essay dimensions of the course. If you're having health issues, if you're having family issues, if you're needing some kind of extension, some sort of accommodation, talk to me. We can almost certainly work something out. That's pretty much all my messages for today. I really think this course will teach you a lot about Canada, I hope. I hope the course will also teach you a lot about yourself and your place in this country. Some of you may not be Canadians. Some of you may be foreign students visiting the country. But you're here now, and even if you're here only virtually, you're somehow sharing the experience of Canada. So I hope this will give you some sense of that story, of that big picture, and a sense of yourself in that story. In the meantime, you'll be looking at all kinds of interesting stories, you'll be reading a lot and talking to each other, and we'll be engaging in the forums and discussing all of this together. I think you should find this a challenging course, but I hope you'll also find it a fulfilling course in the sense that it teaches you a lot and it gives you a sense of your place in the world. Take care, and we will talk again soon.